So, first question, can you give me your name, what you do, and your seat number?
My name is Nik Milanović. I write This Week in Fintech and manage a small fund as well. And my seat number is 17J,
Nice.
where I just woke up from a 3-hour nap.
Did we just wake you up, or were you awake?
No, I just woke up
Okay.
before.
Okay. Good.
My spidey senses were tingling.
Good.
I was like, I need to
It
go
was
talk
your
to
time.
Justin.
Yeah, it was your time. What? Did you watch a movie?
No, I've been
No,
out.
just napping. Yeah, this has been a tiring week. So, the first thing I want to ask you about is you're building this global platform fintech community, the newsletter. You're doing events now like in every corner of the world, in the global south especially. As an American guy living in South Africa, I'm always really excited and interested to meet other people who have big tech experience, who are not necessarily based here but are interested in and are getting involved in what's happening here. So I'd love to just get your perspective, like first and foremost, on like why are you interested in emerging markets, and maybe in the context also of like the This Week in Fintech and the newsletter and everything. Like why has that been a focus for you coming from the States?
That's a good question. I think to an extent I didn't really have a choice but to be interested in
Why is that?
fintech developing outside the US. Well, my parents both worked for the World Bank, and they would take me a lot of places growing up, including on work trips with them. And I went to an international school and everything. And so I think I kind of had this like predisposition from the start to look outside the US to find interesting things going on in the world that were very different. And then, when I got into fintech, there was kind of this like aha moment I had, like, I don't know, maybe like 8 years ago, when I was thinking, okay, what we're doing in the US is really interesting in fintech, but the opportunities in places with, newer financial services with less financial infrastructure is massive. I was sitting in this meeting of people talking about fintech in Africa, and it was in San Francisco, which makes me feel like a little bit of a poser. But people were talking about, whether Bitcoin could be like a viable like form of currency, internationally across borders. And this is at the time when like nobody really cared what Bitcoin was, and so it kind of clicked for me that like there was so much more opportunity in places where there was, relatively less financial inclusion and more underbanked people. And so I wrote this article for TechCrunch like 6 years ago saying we have to start looking at fintech development in Africa. And it was like a really poorly written article. And like when I look back at some of the reasoning, it was just like really bad. But like I do feel like a little vindicated now, seeing how much development in all these different cities there's been. And it makes me really think maybe it's time to finally leave New York and actually, do what you did. And
Sorry, you're moving to South Africa too? Or were you breaking news on the podcast?
I can't promise anything.
You might. We can go house. We can
Everything runs through my girlfriend.
We can look at apartments in Cape Town while we're here. We're on the way.
She would kill me.
Yeah. Nice. And so I suppose, what were you thinking? Like, what was the story behind starting This Week in Fintech and the events? Did you have an expectation that you were gonna grow it into this thing and leave and launch a fund, or was it a bit more organic and incremental than that?
No, people ask me like semi-regularly, what's the 5-year plan? And they're very disappointed when I tell them that there really isn't one.
Yeah. Not even a 5-year plan. There's no plan whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
Or at least that's the case for me.
20 minutes ago, I didn't know I was going to be on this podcast.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm freestyling it. I started the newsletter for my team 2.5 years ago when I was at Pedal, because there wasn't really a good, concise way for us to get like a weekly update of everything going on in fintech. And then I forwarded it to a few friends, and they said, hey, sign me up. Like Charlie Ma was one of the early readers. And I realized, okay, like maybe actually people need this kind of weekly forum for the rundown in fintech. And so it grew over the last 2.5 years. And it was just a newsletter until the end of lockdown last year in the US, when finally, lockdowns were starting to get lifted after COVID. And I kind of put out an errant tweet just saying, hey, does anybody want to do like an in-person fintech event in New York? And it got such a huge response that we ended up throwing an event. And then, another light bulb went off, and I said, it's probably not just New York where people are like dying for some kind of social interaction.
Dying.
I was extremely awkward in my first like in-person event. I remember I was like mid-conversation at this first fintech meetup and holding a plate of cheese and crackers. And like while I was talking to somebody, I just spilled the entire plate on my feet and legs. And I was just like, this is a bad idea. But it all just kind of grew organically from that.
Yeah. No, you seemed like a much better networker when I was with you this week. So no mishaps like that.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then so the fund. I think right there's a nice trend of people who have come before you and me as well of media turned solo GPs. So at what point in time were you like, it's time to launch the fund? Was there anything that happened that gave you the conviction that you could do it, or was that again sort of just like an organic thing from writing angel checks to having the distribution to deciding that you were going to go do this?
So the quick backstory is the fund wasn't kind of completely cut from whole cloth. I'd been managing a fintech angel syndicate for about 1.5 years before announcing the fund. And at the 1 year mark, I took a look back and I said, okay, what's going well, what's not going well? We had cut checks for about $2.5 million to 40 companies. And I felt really good about the quality of the people in the syndicate and the quality of the founders we were backing. But founders would come to us and say, hey, we want you to invest. We have all this allocation. We'd say, well, everybody's writing small personal checks, so we're not able to absorb all of it. But we'll like rate you a small check. So I decided, okay, well, there's probably like a space to play here for a slightly larger fund that can actually absorb these allocations. And, Sheil is always somebody I've looked up to over at Better Tomorrow Ventures and kind of a mentor. And he was somebody who I pinged early on about this, as well as Tillman over at Flourish and Matt Harris over at Bain Capital Ventures. And they were all really supportive. And I initially just asked them for advice. I was like, would you, be somebody who could give me advice as I do this? So they said, well, we'd actually like to invest. And like that validation meant a lot to me.
Yeah.
I think when you're doing something new for the first time, having somebody who has conviction in you, like really can make the difference. And so that was like 7 or 8 months ago when I started working on it. So it's all been behind the scenes since then, but it was nice to finally announce it. And like by the time I did announce it, there is this good kind of track record of others like Packy McCormack and Nick Sharma, raising their own funds.
Yeah. No one seems to mention Harry Stebbings anymore, but that's the one who I care the most about because he was the podcaster turned solo GP and not the newsletter writer turned solo GP. But I guess it's all the same, So yeah, I mean, I guess in that vein, I'm in the middle of launching or raising a small, comparatively small pre-seed fund. So what advice do you have for me? Both on the raising piece, and then also just as somebody who's a pretty novice angel investor myself on the sort of deal flow decisioning. I know that our sort of investment focus is different, but in general, what sorts of things have you had to learn through the process of both investing and raising money that would help me as I get going?
So I think like the number one thing I'll say is I think you absolutely should do that. I think for all
it's happening. It's a thing.
But for like all the media attention that the increased investment in African fintech gets, like comparatively to a lot of other markets, like the dollar value is still really low, and there are some like notable gaps, especially like a later stage gap where there's a lot of pre-seed funds now, but not necessarily a lot of later stage ones. But I think that the opportunity for people to continue bringing capital and effectively sourcing really talented entrepreneurs like you're doing is massive. And it makes me feel sometimes like a little bit of a poser, not being based in the countries that I'm investing in. But I'm glad that I get a chance to come over here and meet people like you and meet people like we met over the last couple of days in Nairobi and Kampala.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really great idea. I would actually say like talk to as many people as possible about it, which is what you're doing, because I think the network effect of being somebody in this space and having the word out about your intention to start this fund is massively helpful. Like a lot of people will say, well, it's not a fit for me, but there's people I know who will want to invest. It's not a fit for me, but there's founders I know who should definitely be working with you. And the last thing I'll say is like a lot of people ask me about track record, which like luckily for me, I kind of had these 18 months with the syndicate.
Yeah.
But like, even 18 months in a bull market, it's like all paper gains.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, like it's a little bit of a catch-22. Like if you haven't managed money before, people don't trust you to manage money now. But I feel like if you go back and look at your rationale for like how you thought the space would evolve and like the first principles you had for having conviction around certain ideas. Like that's a lot more important at the end of the day to the decision making that you're going to do under the fund.
Yeah, it feels really wild to me, this notion that, you know, on the track record piece in particular, like the degree to which writing and creating content around something sort of incessantly for 2+ years and triangulating and having a point of view, like, probably does matter. And then when I'm feeling like a particularly large degree of imposter syndrome, I remind myself that there's also, you know, like investment bankers turned venture investors who, you know, have the finance background but don't necessarily have the sort of early stage perspective. So I guess you know, from both directions, like there's always some learning to do for people who are doing this for the first time. At least that's the rationale I give myself.
So when did you, like, in your mind decide that you were going to start a fund, and what was the reason?
It's a good question. I don't exactly know when. Like I think I was just also seeing these guys, like, you know, some of the people that we talked about before do it, and just always thought that it was a sort of natural progression. But then for me in particular, like the urgency was greater as I just like started to be around the ecosystem longer and just knew these companies really early and watched them grow without any skin in the game. Mm-hmm. Right? So to some extent, for some companies, the deal flow was already there, right? So I just talked to Tesh, and I talked to Tesh, like I met him first, like before they raised their seed round, right? We're going to Stitch tomorrow. Like I used to have lunch at Stitch's offices, like when it was just 8 people, and now they're a huge company and just raised a $20 million A as well. So like I was just like, it's time to do this, because I'm seeing a lot of deals and a lot of people reach out, and I don't want all the companies to pass me by any longer. I don't know if it's a good reason to do it or not, but that's a big part of it.
Well, I mean, something that like you touched on there is like the pattern matching of having seen, you know, the difference between early stage companies that become successful and ones that don't. Yeah. Which I think is like incredibly important to like solidifying your investment methodology.
And I suppose that's actually what's maybe the way that I should have answered it, which is true also, is that I have a better perspective and a stronger point of view now than ever before. So, right?
So what would you say you're the most excited to do, like after you cut a check? Like it really feels like something that's driving it here is like your deep connection to these teams that like you meet early on, and like your excitement about what they're building and like wanting to have skin in the game. So like, you know, guys like us with these like tiny funds, like the check size is never going to be a differentiator. Yeah. But like, I feel like there's so much that somebody like you can do outside of writing a check. Yeah.
Well, like very, very explicitly, like to the degree that I can make the media business work for the portfolio, like I'm interested in doing that. But, you know, I've got my perspectives, and I want to put forth narratives that I think are important for the ecosystem, and to the extent that those narratives are beneficial and in the direction of, you know, what the portfolio companies are trying to achieve as well. You know, I'd really like to do that, and I think the hope in particular is, if I'm investing pre-seed, that to some extent some of that storytelling helps these companies as they're going on to raise their seed and their A, and, you know, later on, and because I mean all the fundraising is stories. So I have this idea in my head that I'll write investment memos and then publish them. Whether the companies are okay with that or not, I guess remains to be seen. But that's something like I'm really also interested in doing a lot of this in public as well, and I hope that would be beneficial both for, you know, me, for the ecosystem, and for the companies as well.
Dude, it's funny you mentioned that. I'm about to do the same thing with 2 of the first investments we made. It's just, which like I'd love to share the template with you and actually get your feedback, your critical notes before I actually publish it, because like when you're a writer, when you're a podcaster, when you're a creative, I feel like what you're really good at doing is constructing a narrative, and that narrative is what helps you get excited about investment opportunity. And it's, you know, seeing the upside potential and seeing the future state of the world as the founder sees it, and like being able to communicate that in a memo, I think is such a helpful part of like crystallizing like why you made a decision in investment. Yeah. Like I'd love to read those memos. What about like for the flip? You know, does the flip grow into something different alongside this fund? Does it like continue to expand?
Yeah, that's a good question. that's, I mean, the single biggest concern I have right now is just bandwidth. So yeah, I mean, the Flip will keep growing. Right, I guess we're doing like video podcasts for the first time now, so I might have to sell a sponsorship to this, before. But no, I mean, that's I don't know. I mean, I think like what you said as well. Like I never really had a plan. The Flip just started as a mechanism for me to learn, and then I've, it's sort of grown in its own way at every step in the way, just realizing that there was the next thing to do, and there's going to be a next thing after this. I just, I'll know it when it's time to do it, I suppose.
Can I ask you a super tactical question?
Yeah.
I'm like dying to add a good podcaster to This Week in Fintech. But I don't know anything about podcasting. Like, how do I find a good podcaster? Like, what do I look for? Like, what should I be? And also, I would never want to just put something out there that's undifferentiated and, already exists in the world.
Yeah.
Like, should I even want to add a podcast to This Week in Fintech?
That's a good question. I mean, the format of the Flip is this narrative style show. Much like you also said, I don't want to just have a thing where it's just two guys having a conversation, even though that's like what we're doing now. But so for me, I just said I like Freakonomics, the podcast. I just want to do a Freakonomics style podcast just in the African tech context, right? And then but to your question, like about finding someone, I think that's the biggest challenge that I have as well, is like, it feels to me, or at least I've convinced myself, that this is like a really specialized thing where somebody knows how to tell narratives and is a storyteller and is also deeply curious in the subject matter, right? And maybe I'm just sort of like blowing smoke and convincing myself that I'm more important than I actually am. But like, I would actually start with the question also of like, what does like the This Week in Fintech style show look like, right? Like almost start with the format, because right, everyone has a podcast, and now it's like, you kind of do, you'll have like your listeners anyway, but what are you trying to achieve? Are you just trying to, create inventory? Or are you trying to like actually like have an interesting discourse and, have it be something that's different and that's useful? And if so, like, start with that. And in terms of how to find someone, like, I have no fucking idea. Like, I think they'll present themselves, but it's probably the same as like Dealflow, like just talking to a lot of people. I actually sort of think, it's not like I don't think of myself as a journalist, right? Like I'm sure we're doing like a lot of like journalistic activities, but like the line between like content creation and media is blurred so much that, the question about like who can do it, like I don't think everybody can do it, but like there's probably more people than we realize who have the skill set. And, if there's an opportunity to leverage a platform like This Week in Fintech to do something, or somebody who's always said, I would love to do a podcast, but don't have the time or don't know what I'm doing or whatever, like, I suspect there's a ton of people out there like that, right?
Yeah,
you don't even need to have a good voice. You just need to be curious.
Your voice is so soothing to me.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
thank you.
My hope is to find somebody who's super young and ambitious and has all just like wanted a platform to like take off. How many episodes do you think you've recorded now? Do you know?
Somewhere in the ballpark of maybe somewhere between 40 and 50, maybe 50 plus.
Wow.
But
do you feel like you've become a better interviewer over that time?
No, because our probably, to be honest, but because our episodes are thematic and everything is highly editorialized and highly edited, I always find that I'm probably hiding behind the format a little bit. Like, I don't need to ask as good of questions because everything is so edited and narrated anyway. Yeah. But I've probably gotten better. Like, I used to be nervous at the beginning to interview people in particular, and now there's like some people actually that still make me nervous, but like for the most part, like I feel comfortable in asking questions and will always do a lot of research in advance. Like, that's an important part of all of this, obviously. But
the nice thing about podcasts is people love talking about themselves.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost the most universal trait I've ever seen.
Yeah, but that's actually the challenge, though, is everyone thinks that what they're talking about is interesting, and a lot of times it's not, right? but
Case in point. What's up?
no. But what I also would say is that so in our format, I've interviewed maybe close to 200 people now, but it's only 50 episodes, and a lot of people who I've interviewed have like never seen the light of day, and a lot of interviews, will be an hour long and we'll just use 5 minutes. So that sort of like ruthlessness from like a editing perspective is like something that was really hard for me at the beginning, but like I learned, like in order to make it interesting and pithy, like just cut out everything, like
So
just
what's the
find
difference
sound
between
bites.
so it's really like you'll talk to people and feel like what you came out with isn't compelling enough to merit creating an episode about it.
But it's more that like I have a specific theme or story that I want to tell, and there's only so much of what we talked about that fits within that, right? And so we'll talk about a wide breadth of stuff, but then only a small portion of that will be related to the episode that we're producing.
So do you like decide on the narrative or the theme before you have the interviews? Oh, interesting.
Well, I know the theme generally, but then I don't exactly know what the story is going to be. So it's kind of like shooting at a moving target, right? And then obviously ultimately the theme is determined to some extent by like what the subject matter experts are telling me, right? So I've got like a loose general idea of what the episode's going to be about. And then often though, they end up looking like something different than
but it's not like a blank canvas. You kind of go in there like understanding where you're trying to go.
At the beginning it was definitely a blank canvas, but now I have a bit more direction in advance typically about what we're going to talk about before I sit down and speak to somebody.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it gives you a good it'll be so interesting like looking back 10 years from now when like you're managing multi-billion-dollar fund and you have like an army of podcasters under you, and like you're the most like well-known media in African fintech. Like seeing how those narratives changed over time and seeing like how the stories kind of built on themselves, and like looking back through like the history of fintech and seeing like the narrative arc kind of follow like new developments be interesting.
No, I agree. I think that's the one of the most fun things about like learning and sharing in public is just seeing like that public ledger of takes and of like what was topical at that moment of time and seeing how it evolves. I mean,
and like where the light bulbs go off.
Yeah, exactly.
So of everybody you've talked to on this plane, who is the best and who is the worst?
Well, we're definitely talking for the longest.
That might not be a good thing.
No one else has asked me questions except for you, but you're the fellow media guy. But I don't think I can do a best and worst. That's not fair.
I just go mad with power when somebody puts a microphone in my hands.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
If there's one thing you could have on this plane that's not here right now, what would you have?
More legroom.
What'd you say?
More legroom.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah. And maybe some more snacks, but...
Did you eat the meal?
Yeah, it was not good.
That was the advice I got.
Did you eat?
I did not. I was asleep.
Yeah, it wasn't very good. So, but like when you're on a plane and you're hungry, what can you do?
If you were talking to somebody coming to Cape Town for the first time and they wanted to do something that was not like Table Mountain, going around the Cape, Stellenbosch, Robben Island, Lion's Head, like all the routine things, what's like your most like off the map fun thing to do in Cape Town?
Off the map. I mean, there's like from a hiking perspective, there's a lot of things that are not necessarily on like your average tourist list that are stunningly beautiful that I would recommend. Some like outside of Cape Town as well. So if you're in Cape Town, you don't want to go far. There's one called like Castile Port, for example, that takes off from Camps Bay. That's stunningly beautiful. And then there's ones like out in like Franschhoek and Stellenbosch as well. And then it's just like for me, I've always found that like what's the most exciting part about like living abroad is just like spending a lot of time with like locals, right? So it's just not necessarily about what you do, but just who you're spending time with, right?
Yeah. Traveling with somebody who lives in the area is so much different.
Yeah.
So
what are they saying? I'm just trying to listen.
pitching just to Norman. Please wrap up the
Yeah.
podcast.
I
This interview
actually only
sucks.
have
There's
two-
no engaging content here.
I only have 2 more people.